I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to this remote edition of the New York Times Close Up. Later, we'll handicap some of the 2023 elections with Times political reporter Neil Vigdor. But first, Governor Kathy Hochul delivered her first State of the State address this week as an elected governor. Having won the narrowest gubernatorial election in decades, what does her address tell us about what to expect? And what does the rise and fall of George Santos teach us? Joining us, New York Times contributing writer Eleanor Randolph. Eleanor, we know that the State of the State gives the broad outlines of what a governor is going to do. So the devil is always in the details when the budget comes out. What do you make of her speech and how it compares to previous governors?
Frankly, she's not a great speaker, but she makes her points and she sounds quite earnest about them. As you say, the State of the State is kind of a wish list, and then we see the details when the budget comes out. But she did outline a few things that I think we're going to watch. One is she wants to put $1 billion towards mental health, and that will be a really important change. $1 billion used to sound like a lot of money, but that budget is like over 220 billion. So it's not quite chump change, but it's not an incredible amount of money for the state. She wants to just open up some extra beds in some of the hospitals she wants to give, for people who are troubled, and she wants to have some sort of housing, specialized housing for some of these people who are, homeless and having great difficulty, because New Yorkers, especially in the city, are seeing so much of that, of people in trouble on the streets. So that's a big thing. The other thing that she waded into that I thought was interesting is that she wants to deal with bail reform, and the progressives and don't really want to meddle with it very much. They don't think bail reform is very important. But what she's talking about is, it seems to me, is to move the New York State's bail reform laws closer to the federal bail reform laws, so that the judge has more discretion, especially when people have been arrested time after time. There's some other, as I said, it's a laundry list, but those are the two things that really jumped out at me.
This is after we took the discretion away from the judges, right?
Right, some of it, most of it, yeah.
Now, she talks about more money for mental health, more money for prosecutors, more money for affordable housing, but not to raise taxes, at least not income taxes. Where is all this money going to come from?
Oh, that is a great mystery, Sam. I don't really know where it's going to come from. Maybe they're going to borrow some of it. There was a big bond issue, last year. And so there is some money there that they haven't really spent yet. But I did the same thing. I looked at it, I said, where are you going to get all this? And I don't see, she talks about people leaving the state. If she puts more taxes on the wealthy or businesses, they're going to start to leave. And so it's a balancing act. And I don't know how she's going to do it, frankly.
She seemed to be very open-minded to the proposals that Mayor Adams has made, courting him almost to the possible, not detriment, but to maybe to the cost of other areas of the state. What is that about? Is she, in fact, courting the mayor, or does she realize, which is true, that New York City is the economic engine that does drive the state?
That's right. What a relief it is to have the governor and the mayor actually working together after de Blasio and Cuomo. But the thing is, if you go back to the election, what the Republicans really talked about was safety. And so that has moved up as one of the prime issues for the mayor, and she is working to help him with that. The other one, as you mentioned earlier, is housing. And it's not clear to me how she's going to create these hundreds of thousands of new housing opportunities, none of them with gas stoves, by the way. So it's I really am thankful that she and the mayor are working together, because the state has most of the power and the city has most of the money and goods and everything else.
And also how she's going to convince suburbs to allow multiple dwelling housing in their neighborhoods. I'm glad you mentioned housing opportunities or apartments. I hate when we talk about units of housing. I never met anyone who lived in a unit. Oh, why has she run into some opposition in her nomination of the chief judge? Do you think that she would have scoped that out a little more carefully and known what the reaction would have been?
Yeah, I that has surprised me too. The sort of folks in Albany say he's not going to make it through. Hector LaSalle is his name. That the that the progressives in both houses feel that he's been too pro-union, anti-union and pro-business, and that he really he really is not your normal Democrat. But the Bar Association has given him, 5 stars, and other judges have said that he's an excellent jurist and deserves to be at the top of the court.
The legislature just last month voted itself a raise 29%. Does it deserve a raise?
It depends on whether they're doing outside income. To have that much money is for most of us, that's an incredible amount of money. And okay, they do work hard, but so does everybody else in this state who makes any money like that. And the question has always been whether how they could operate their outside income. And I was surprised they didn't come up with some system to limit or even ban outside income for legislators, that this would be their full-time salary.
A quick last question. George Santos, the Republican congressman on Long Island, what should happen to him?
Well, this is, he might resign. He might have already resigned when you and I are talking, as we're talking. But I think there'll be, at some point, he will be forced to resign. There will be a special election. I know that the Democrat, Bob Zimmerman, will probably run again. And there just is a long line of Republicans who are already champing at the bit to get out there and be in that race. I found it really interesting that the Republicans in Long Island really came out and said what they should have said, which was, this guy is a fake, and he's not one of us, and we disown him. And that's the right thing to do, even though if there's a special election, they could lose it to a Democrat.
No, well, maybe we've learned something in politics. That's good to know. Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And next, we'll do what everyone else does about the weather. We'll talk about it. Welcome back. Dramatic images and news reports have been pouring in from California. The state continues to be drenched with storms, dangerous flooding. Can climate change be blamed? The aptly named Henry Fountain covers climate change for the New York Times. He recently wrote about how the last 8 years were the hottest ever recorded. He joins us now from New Mexico. Henry, let me ask you a contrarian question, and I know we should always be careful what we wish for. Here we are in the middle of January in New York, and it's barely snowed yet. What does that mean?
It doesn't really mean all that much. The climate's variable, and some years places have a lot of precipitation. Some years they don't have much. And you're right. Be careful what you wish for, because it is variable. And tomorrow you could get a snowstorm, or next week. So it's not a sign of the apocalypse.
And we'll be asking you why we got so much snow. So is California's mudslides and that change in the weather the same phenomenon? Is it the result of cycles, or is this climate change?
Well, California is an interesting place because California does have extremely variable precipitation. It really varies from year to year. Some years you'll get a lot of these big storms that they're getting now called atmospheric rivers. Some years you won't get a lot. And California relies for something like 50% of its water on these kinds of storms. So the links between climate change and the frequency of those storms is not quite clear. One thing that is clear is that a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. So, and this is seen not just in California, but around the world. So you have, since we're, 2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than we were, in the 19th century, we're getting heavier downpours because the air is holding more rain, essentially.
I'm not a science expert, obviously, and you are, I would say. Why is 2 degrees on the thermometer such a big difference in affecting climate?
Yeah, you wouldn't think it would be, but in fact, the Earth has been in a delicate balance for a long time. Obviously, the atmosphere has warmed up in the past, but well in the past. But in the last, thousands and thousands of years, the Earth's been very stable, and so we've now disrupted that by burning fossil fuels and putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And just a little change really just has, it affects things like oceanic circulation, atmospheric circulation, ice melting in the Arctic, and all those things sort of have amplifying effects. They kind of build on each other, and you just you start to see the impacts. And one of the things that climate scientists are saying, they've always predicted that we'd see these kind of impacts: extreme storms, more intense droughts, worsening wildfire seasons, all that stuff. But they're saying it's actually happening faster than they expected. So it may not seem like much, but it doesn't take much to sort of tip the Earth out of balance.
Henry, you've written in the Times that there seems to be more evidence of the impact of climate change during warmer times, but perhaps less so during colder times, during the winter. Why is that?
Well, it's a complicated subject. There is evidence that that even in cold weather, global warming can affect storms, and it's the same thing I was just talking about. Warmer air, even if it's cold air, if it's warmer than it used to be, there's going to be more moisture in it. So we tend to see, certainly in some parts of the United States and other parts of the world, you see heavier snowstorms now. The issue of these cold snaps, like the big one we had a couple of weeks ago, the one that really slammed Texas, I guess it was last year, maybe 2021, though that is a function of really cold Arctic air coming down into lower latitudes, into North America. And there's some scientists who think that's really related to climate change. And in fact, the effect of climate change in the Arctic is what they say is responsible for it. There's a lot of scientists who don't see the evidence for it. So that's an example of one of these very healthy debates about climate change. I mean, people talk about, climate change is still open to debate. And, the fundamental idea that we are changing the climate and the climate is warming, that's really no longer open to debate. That's happening. Just about every scientist would say that's the case. The kind of debate that's going on now is, what are the impacts? How bad are the impacts? How fast do the impacts happen? And why does the climate affect these things? So this question of cold snaps being affected by climate change, that's one of those kinds of debates.
Henry, maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but you did write a story recently that thanks to a cleanup of sorts of emissions from China, the weakened ozone layer seems to be on track to being restored over the next couple of decades. Does that mean we're being too catastrophic in our view that with technology, with cooperation from countries around the world, we are going to be able to somehow cope with climate change? We're going to find some bacteria that eats carbon dioxide or something like that?
Well, the issue of ozone layer, that's a function of, it's not directly related to climate, but that's also a function of this treaty that was signed in the 1980s by every country on Earth, the Montreal Protocol. And it's really the most effective environmental treaty that's ever been enacted. What's needed to fight climate change is a similar unanimous agreement and unanimous a way to sort of take action to control emissions, to countries make pledges to make sure those pledges are carried out to reduce emissions. I'm an optimist. I think they've done it for ozone and the Montreal Protocol. I mean, it's much harder to control carbon dioxide emissions. There's huge amounts of them compared to ozone destroying chemicals, but it's an example of the kind of international cooperation that has to happen.
Well, good. We can start our weekend on that happy note. Henry Fountain of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, we'll look at the 2023 elections. Many political watchers are anticipating the 2024 presidential race, but before then, there are also a lot of pivotal state and local elections this year. Joining us is Neil Vigdor, political reporter with the New York Times. Neil, you wrote recently about some of those races, one in particular, Kentucky. Only Kentucky, you said, features an incumbent Democrat who's seeking re-election in a state where Donald Trump won in 2020. So how do you handicap that election?
Well, thanks for having me, Sam. So in Kentucky is really fascinating. If you look at the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump got 62% of the vote there, and Joe Biden only won two counties in Kentucky, Jefferson and Fayette. And you have an incumbent Democrat, Andy Beshear. He is the only sitting Democrat in a state won by Trump who is running for re-election this year. Louisiana, you have a Democrat, John Bel Edwards, but he's term limited, so he's not running this year. Beshear has about $5 million in his war chest. His father was a governor. For the most part, he has avoided controversy. Republicans, though, being a red state, they are hoping to win back the governor's office. Beshear beat Matt Bevin, who was a Republican incumbent 4 years ago. And one of the things that Republicans have tried to seize on is, early on in the coronavirus pandemic, there was a whole flap over church attendance when he had issued a stay-at-home order, and he had actually deployed Kentucky State Police to monitor some of the churches that were flouting the order and monitoring churchgoers. And people who religious conservatives were furious about that, and kind of contrasted that with in Texas. Greg Abbott said that church worship and religious services were kind of essential early on in the pandemic. So that's one of the things that Republicans have tried to key on. And there are a number of Republicans that are running for governor. It's a crowded field.
In Mississippi, we have Governor Reeves, a Republican seeking a second term. He is likely, as you've written, I think, to face a primary. How much are the Republicans eating each other up in this 2023 campaign season?
I think we're going to see a number of contentious primaries. Governor Reeves, his job approval ratings, he's one of the lowest rated governors in the country on the Republican side. And so you have a number of people who hold statewide office or in the legislature who are eyeing this race. He's the only one who's declared so far. But as we saw in the midterms, there is going to be this dynamic of Republicans kind of cannibalizing each other in very contentious primaries. Going back to Kentucky, I mean, there is a strong chance of a contentious primary. You have Daniel Cameron, who is the state attorney general. He is the first Black person to be elected attorney general in Kentucky. He's been endorsed by Trump. And, he kind of made a lot of news when he announced that the two police officers who shot Breonna Taylor were not going to be indicted. He's been kind of discussed as a protege of Mitch McConnell, who's obviously from Kentucky. But then another Republican is Kelly Craft, who was Trump's ambassador to the United Nations and to Canada. And she has the backing of James Comer, who's the congressman, who's the head of the House Oversight Committee. So that could be a pretty bruising primary of two Trump acolytes.
Neil, are we likely to see the same self-destruction in the mayoral reelection in Chicago among Democrats?
Well, Lori Lightfoot has probably over 10 challengers, a number of people from her own party. The kind of the most prominent one is Chuy Garcia. He's a congressman, represents Cook County, is born in Mexico. He previously had lost a runoff to Rahm Emanuel. And he's going after the Lightfoot hard, and she is already on the attack. She came out with a commercial criticizing him for taking campaign contributions from Sam Bankman-Fried, and also a PAC supporting him. His congressional candidacy got money from him. So it's already turning pretty nasty.
Neil, trying to put things in perspective, you've also written that Congressman George Santos is hardly the only public official who has embellished his resume. What happened to the others, and have the others gone as far as he appears to have done?
No, I mean, I think that he's kind of in a category all to himself. I mean, certainly over the years, there have been, circumstances, one that comes to mind is I used to cover Connecticut politics. And back in 2010, the Times had a story about Richard Blumenthal, who was the longtime attorney general here. And he had made statements that gave the impression that he had served in the Marines in Vietnam when he was a reservist at home. And he, apologized at the time and said that he did not mean to mislead anyone. It did not. It certainly, it didn't stop him from being elected to the Senate against Linda McMahon, who spent $50 million in that race. And there have been other situations where people have talked about their life history or their credentials. One of the big ones in the midterms was J.R. Majewski, who was the House candidate in Ohio, who talked about deploying with the Air Force to Afghanistan after the 2001 terrorist attacks. And the Associated Press did a story, and we did one subsequently, where there was no record that he was in the Air Force, but they have no record of him being in Afghanistan.
Our thanks to Neil Vigdor of the New York Times. And coming up next, my thoughts on lying and politics. George Washington never claimed to have chopped down his father's cherry tree. He wasn't even alive when the story first surfaced. Nobody, when Washington was around or since, confirmed the arborcide firsthand. Yet virtually every American child is taught to embrace the myth as a totem of the first president's integrity. So why all the hand-wringing because George Santos, the Long Island Republican congressman, faked his biography? Don't all politicians lie? A wiseacre once cracked that you can tell when a politician is lying because his lips are moving. No one, Hannah Arendt concluded, has ever counted truthfulness as a political virtue. Speaking of virtue, someone also said there would be no sex without lies, just as Bill Clinton. Maybe there'd be no politics without lies either. Unfortunately, said Tom Wheeler, the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, you're allowed to lie. But whatever the consequences of electing a self-confessed liar to Congress, the biography of George Santos raises a more disquieting question. Before he was elected, which Republicans vetted him as their candidate? Which Democrats scrutinized him as a rival? Some people say the First Amendment be damned. Lying politicians should be against the law. One group tried that. We demand, they said, that there be a legal campaign against those who propagate deliberate political lies and disseminate them through the press. That group was the German National Socialist Party in 1920. Part of the problem in this case was the press. How come no reporter researched the would-be congressman's record before the election? Sometimes no news can be even worse than fake news. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.